If you listen to history podcasts, then I'm sure you've heard of Dan Carlin. And if you haven't, well, then you're welcome. Enjoy the hours and hours and hours of some of the best stuff out there. He's really good. But I want to focus on one thing that Dan has said, and I believe that he said it on multiple occasions. But I remember him saying it when talking about the Battle of Cannae, when Hannibal surrounded and destroyed the Romans. He mentioned how, for the guys in the middle of the Roman crush, basically just standing there in the heat with their fellow soldiers packed in all around them so tightly they couldn't even raise their arms to try and defend themselves. Listening to the screams of the dying men all around them as the Carthaginians slowly closed in, hacking and slashing away at the defenseless Romans. He mentioned that this moment in history could possibly be one of the worst ever times and places to be alive for a human being, and I don't disagree. But I'd like to think that the people who were stuck inside the walled city of Nanking during the hours and days just after the Japanese Imperial Army took the city back in 1937 would also think that, sadly for them, that time would quite easily be in the running for top spot of worst time and place to ever be alive for a human. Now, this video is not meant to be used to disparage Japan or the Japanese people. Let's not start thinking that any Japanese alive today would condone the actions of these monsters who committed the rape of Nanking. And let's not act like these things are exclusive to one race or religion or creed. No, we all know that bad people can come from anywhere. This video is also not for glorifying violence or the disgusting and terrible acts committed that happened to innocent people. It's hopefully just a reminder and a way for these people's stories to be told, and maybe somehow, some way in the future, if anybody reads these survivor stories or even listens to this video, it could stop even just one person from doing something terrible to another human being. Now, let us get to their stories, and I thank you for watching, but I truly hope that you do not enjoy this video.
My sister and I were two children picked out from the dead piles. My name is Sha Shukin, born in May of 1929, Nanjing. For the Japanese invasion of Nanjing, my family had 9 people, including my grandfather, Ni Zusheng, in his 70s, my grandmother, Mrs. Ni Zhu, in her 70s, father Sha Ting, in his 40s, mother Mrs. Sha Ni, in her 30s, the eldest sister, Sha Shufang, 16 years old, the second sister, Sha Shulang, 14 years old, the second youngest sister, Sha Shuyun, 4 years old, the youngest sister, Sha Shufen, 1 year old, and 8-year-old me. We lived in the house of a Mohammedan whose last name was Ha at the number 5 of Chin Lukao, Changnan. At that place, except my sister Sha Shuyun and me, the whole family was killed by the Japanese army. My sister and I were 2 children picked out from the dead piles. On the morning of December 13, 1937, a group of Japanese soldiers, about 30 people, came to knock on our door. They shot the owner of the house, Mr. Ha, immediately when he opened the door. Seeing this, my father kneeled down in front of them, begging them not to kill any more people, but he was shot dead by them as well. My mother was scared to hide under the table with the 1-year-old youngest sister, but she was dragged out by the Japanese soldiers. They grabbed my sister away from my mother, throwing her fiercely to the ground to kill her. Then they tore away my mother's clothes, and several soldiers gang raped her before killing her with the bayonet. They cruelly stuck a bottle into my mother's private part. Later, several Japanese soldiers forced into the neighboring room where hides my grandfather, grandmother, and two elder sisters. They tried to rape my elder sisters, but were strongly resisted by my grandfather and grandmother, so they killed the two old people brutally. Then, the Japanese soldiers tore away all the clothes of my two elder sisters. They gang raped them before killing them with the bayonet. The soldiers stuck my grandmother's walking stick into my eldest sister's private part. I was hiding in the quilt on the bed. I cried aloud of scare. Then I was stabbed on the back by the Japanese soldiers 3 times, so I fainted. I didn't know how long had passed. When I was awakened by the cry of my 4-year-old sister, I found we were surrounded by the bodies of my family. We couldn't do nothing but cried loudly, wishing to wake up mother. We looked for food everywhere. Fortunately, there were some parched rice and rice crust left in the kitchen. We lived on these food and the cold water in the water vat for 14 days, accompanying by the bodies of our families. Later, we were successively adopted by the Hall of the Old, a charity institute, and my uncle. My uncle's family was also very poor. In order to reduce the life burden, since 12, I had to support myself. I once sold vegetables and served as the servant. In this way, 7 people in my family were killed by Japanese soldiers in a very short time. Whenever I thought about it, I couldn't help crying, and I almost cried my eyes out every time. In this way, 7 people in my family were killed by Japanese soldiers in a very short time. Whenever I thought about it, I couldn't help crying, and I almost cried my eyes out every time. In October 1949, after the establishment of the new China, my life began to become better. In 1954, I married to Zhang Hongzhang, and then we raised 3 children.
My name is Ni Guoping, and my family lived near Shaoshen Palace within the city. Before the Japanese army attacked Nanjing, their planes often dropped bombs over the city. At the time, Baibatang was the place that was most severely bombed. All of the civilians were scared to hide from place to place, and some people hid in the refugee zone, some fled to the countryside, and others dug themselves dugouts to hide. At that time, our family fled to Shaanxi in the northwest of the city. We were hiding on a small beach, surrounded by water, and we built a hut for shelter. One day in December 1937, Japanese soldiers came to Shaanxi area. We didn't dare to cook at home, fearing that the smoke in the chimney would attract Japanese soldiers' attention. But several days later, we couldn't bear the hunger anymore, and we thought that the tension might be eased since the Japanese soldiers had entered the city. My mother then let my father go to the river to wash vegetables and rice. However, as my father just arrived at the riverside, 5 Japanese soldiers fired 3 times at him. My father was shot and fell down to the ground. My poor father died this way. My poor mother, when she heard the gunshot, ran to my father in a hurry, trying to hold him in her arms. The Japanese soldiers, they shot at my mother and killed her as well. My poor mother died without a word. I was only 11 years old. I ran out and saw my parents lying on the ground, and the Japanese army shot at me and shot me in my shoulder blade. The wound of the scar can still be seen today. Then I fell down to the ground bleeding and lost consciousness. My grandfather was already over 70 years old then. He asked for help to bury my parents, but in the process they encountered 6 or 7 Japanese soldiers. One of the soldiers hit my grandfather on the head with a gun handle, with his brains bursting forth. My grandfather fell down to the riverside and died miserably. The people who helped with carrying my parents' bodies jumped into the river so as to have a narrow escape. Over 20 days later, my sister-in-law was collecting clothes at home, and she was seen by the Japanese soldiers who immediately came after her. At that time, my sister-in-law had been pregnant for 7 months. She kneeled down to the ground begging for mercy. My grandmother, with bound feet, also got down on her knees to beg, but my sister-in-law was raped by the 5 Japanese soldiers. As my sister-in-law cried for help, my uncle rushed in and tried to stop that, but was shot dead by a Japanese soldier. On that night, my sister-in-law had a fever, and her bleeding couldn't be stopped. The fetus in the belly was aborted, and she died too. My grandmother was so scared that she almost died. Later, when we went back home near Xiaoshen Palace, as we passed through Jiangdongben, we saw a bridge that was blown up. The killed people were thrown into the river, and the Japanese killed people to fill in the river, and the river was full of blood. After returning to Xiaoshen Palace, we lived with our uncle and our aunt. At that time, my uncle made a living by selling sesame seed cakes, but the good times didn't last long. 1 month after the Japanese soldiers entered the city, my uncle was taken away by them. There were 7 Japanese soldiers. They had a killing contest using bayonets in which my uncle was stabbed to death. My aunt was afraid of being raped by the Japanese, and she didn't dare to stop them. When the Japanese soldiers tried to catch her, she knocked her head against a wall and died. My own wound didn't get timely treatment and was infected and festered with worms in it. My other aunt, she helped to pull out the bullet with a vice, but my wound was infected and we didn't have the money to go to the hospital, so I had to leave it up to chance. Since then, I have had a serious sequela. Even eating is difficult for me. I can only do things with one hand, which brings great inconvenience to my life. The Japanese killed 7 people of my family and raped my pregnant sister-in-law. For such pain, I will never forget all my life. The war has brought great pain to our family, and I hate Japanese militarism very much. Some Japanese deny the history and they try to cover up the history, intending to start a second war. We resolutely oppose it and will never allow another war to break out. In December 1937, when the Japanese army approached Nanjing, my parents, wife, and eldest son were all evacuated to northern Jiangsu, leaving me alone to look after the house in Nanjing. At that time, I was a traffic policeman in Nanjing. After the Japanese army occupied Nanjing, they killed everyone they encountered. Nanjing, with the original population of 1 million, almost became an empty city. I hid in the refugee shelter in the former judiciary that was under the protection of the International Committee for Nanking Safety Zone. At around 8 a.m. on December 15th, a dozen Japanese soldiers came suddenly. They drove all the young men outside on the road in a total of 2,000 or more. At about 11 a.m., under the escort of Japanese troops, we all lined up to set off. When we walked to the front of the Capitol Cinema, several trucks drove from behind the team loaded with Japanese soldiers and machine guns. Then, these trucks drove ahead of our team and we continued to march from the Capitol Cinema. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the team arrived at Hanzong Gate. The Japanese soldiers stopped us inside the gate and ordered us to sit down. Then, 2 Japanese soldiers held a long rope with one person holding one end of it respectively, and bound more than 100 people from the crowd. They were surrounded by a large number of Japanese soldiers and taken out of the Hanzong Gate, then were shot dead with machine guns. In this way, I saw batches of people were bound by ropes with 100 or 200 people in each group. Then they were taken out of the Hanzong Gate and shot dead. Some people were too scared to move, and they were just killed on the spot. At around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I was also bound in a group, and the Japanese soldiers took us to the bank of the moat. Driving us to the slope of the bank, I saw 2 machine guns on both sides of the river and then observed dead bodies that were lying in a state of disarray. I was so scared, and I couldn't help myself, and I ran forward a few steps, then threw myself on the bodies. Just as I fell, the machine guns roared, and people fell down one after another. I was buried under the bodies of others. After the machine gun stopped firing, rifle gunshots could be heard, and when the rifles stopped, I felt like someone was walking on top of the pile of bodies. Because I was holding my head in the direction of the riverbank, face down, I felt the pressure of someone walking through the bodies on my back, and at this time, all of a sudden, a bayonet stabbed through onto my back, and it hurt so badly, it turned out that Japanese soldiers, they were stabbing the dying people over me with a bayonet, the tip of which pierced through the bodies of the people above me and stabbed my back. After that, I heard 2 consecutive machine guns, which indicated that they slaughtered another 2 batches of people. Then the Japanese troops set fire to the bodies. I couldn't bear the heavy smoke and risked my life to jump into the Quinhay River under the protection of darkness. Fortunately, there was not much water in the river, and I crawled to the south along the river and reached Swishy Men. Then managed to hide in the kitchen of a house in the vicinity of number 9 Wah Chang Street. I disguised myself as a beggar using straws to cover my face with ashes. I then made great efforts to escape back to the safety zone. Later, I was sent to the Drum Tower Hospital for treatment, staying there for more than 50 days, and the wound was cured to some extent, but I now still have a 5-inch scar on my back. In May 1946, when the Japanese Class A war criminal suspect Iwane Matsui, the culprit of the Nanjing Massacre, was on trial in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo, I was one of the witnesses to testify as the survivor of the massacre in court to give evidence of the atrocities committed by the Japanese troops in Nanjing.
The Japanese soldiers pulled out my elder brother's intestines with a bayonet. In 1937, my family lived in number 166 of Erdao Gangji. On the morning of the 11th day of the 11th month of the lunar calendar, the Japanese occupied Nanjing. My elder brother went out of the cave but never returned home. The whole family was very worried and looked for him everywhere. At nightfall, we found him in the Xinhua soy sauce factory at Erdao Gangji. By the time we found him, he was still breathing, with the intestines exposed to the air. According to his last words, another man, surnamed Chen, was also killed with him. The Japanese soldiers said he was a Chinese soldier and pulled out his intestines with bayonets. My elder brother was only 20 years old then, and the man surnamed Chen was in his 30s. Soon, my elder brother stopped his breathing. Later, we found the body of Chen in a vegetable field with a saber still poking into the body. The man surnamed Chen died miserably and left 2 mute teenage orphans.